Have you ever wondered where the legend of Captain Jack Sparrow truly began? The swaggering pirate with his devil-may-care attitude, his flair for the dramatic, and that unforgettable motto, "Take what you can, give nothing back." Well, the answer might surprise you. Because long before Johnny Depp ever stepped onto a movie set, there was a real pirate sailing the Caribbean whose story was so outrageous, so bold, and so utterly captivating that it would inspire one of cinema's most beloved characters. His name was Jack Rackham, but history remembers him by another name entirely, Calico Jack. Tonight we're going to peel back the layers of Hollywood fiction and discover the flesh and blood man who lived a life more extraordinary than any screenplay could imagine. We'll explore how an ambitious young sailor transformed himself into one of the most notorious pirates of the Golden Age. We'll witness his rise to power, his legendary exploits, and his involvement in some of the most scandalous events ever recorded in pirate history. But most importantly, we'll see how this real Jack became the template for every charming rogue who has graced our screens since.
Or, you scallywags, begging your pardon for cutting in, but lend me your good ear a tick. I, Captain Jack Rackham, would owe ye a king's ransom if you be tapping that like button and leaving a mark of your thoughts in the log below. And if you be hungering for more tales of plunder and peril upon the high seas, then hoist your colours and strike that subscribe bell to sail with me crew. Now then, back to the tale.
Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself transported back to the year 1718. The air is thick with salt spray and the promise of adventure. The Caribbean is a lawless frontier where fortunes are made and lost on the turn of a tide. Spanish treasure fleets lumber through these waters heavy with gold from the New World. Merchant ships ply the trade routes, their holds bursting with valuable cargo. And prowling these same waters like wolves among sheep are the pirates. Men who have rejected the harsh discipline of naval service and the grinding poverty of honest work for something far more dangerous and infinitely more rewarding. In this world of wooden ships and iron men, reputation is everything. A pirate's name can be worth more than his sword. Fear can be more valuable than cannon. And no one understood this better than the man we're about to meet. Jack Rackham wasn't the strongest pirate or the most successful in terms of treasure captured. He wasn't the most feared like Blackbeard or the most cunning like Black Bart Roberts, but he possessed something perhaps more powerful than any of these qualities. He had style. Our story begins not with the crack of cannon fire or the clash of steel, but with something far more mundane and yet infinitely more telling. It begins with a piece of cloth. You see, most pirates of this era wore whatever they could find, steal, or afford. Rough canvas shirts, salt-stained breeches, and weathered leather boots. But Jack Rackham had developed a taste for something different. He had fallen in love with calico, a colourful cotton fabric imported from India. While his contemporaries dressed like the rough sailors they were, Rackham strutted about in bright, patterned clothing that announced his presence long before he spoke a word. This wasn't mere vanity, though vanity certainly played a part. This was calculated theatre. In a world where image meant survival, where a fearsome reputation could cause a merchant crew to surrender without firing a shot, Rackham understood that being memorable was just as important as being dangerous. The bright calico clothing became his trademark, his brand, if you will. It set him apart from every other pirate captain sailing the Caribbean. When sailors in taverns whispered about the pirate in the colourful coat, everyone knew exactly who they meant. Calico Jack had arrived, but how does an ordinary man become an extraordinary pirate? What transforms a regular sailor into a legend? The answer lies in understanding the world Jack Rackham was born into. This was the early 18th century, a time when life for common men was brutally harsh. If you were born poor, you would likely die poor. If you were born to the sea, you would spend your life at the mercy of cruel captains, terrible food, and wages that were often stolen by unscrupulous ship owners. For young men like Jack Rackham, there were precious few paths to advancement. You could join the Royal Navy, and faced the constant threat of death in battle, disease, and the cat-o'-nine-tails for the smallest infractions. You could work aboard merchant vessels where the pay was slightly better but the conditions were hardly improved. Or you could take the third option, the one that whispered promises of freedom, wealth, and adventure. You could become a pirate. Now, we don't know the exact details of Jack Rackham's early life. The historical record is frustratingly sparse when it comes to the origins of most pirates. They were, after all, outlaws operating outside the bounds of civilized society. They didn't keep detailed records or write memoirs for posterity. What we do know comes from trial records, newspaper accounts, and the testimonies of those who encountered them. But from these fragmentary sources, we can piece together a picture of a man who was anything but ordinary. What we can say with certainty is that Jack Rackham first appears in the historical record as a crew member aboard a pirate vessel commanded by a captain named Charles Vane. Now, Charles Vane was everything that Jack Rackham was not. Where Rackham would become known for his style and showmanship, Vane was notorious for his cruelty and unpredictable temper. Where Rackham would later demonstrate a certain gallant charm, Vane was feared even by his own crew for his violent outbursts and harsh discipline. Serving under Vane was like learning piracy from a master craftsman, albeit a particularly brutal one. Vane's ship was a floating school of maritime crime, and Jack Rackham proved to be an eager student. He learned how to read the wind and weather, how to identify a promising prize on the horizon, and how to inspire fear in the hearts of merchant sailors. But perhaps most importantly, he learned how not to lead. You see, Charles Vane's greatest weakness was his inability to balance authority with the democratic ideals that most pirate crews demanded. Pirates, as we've discussed before, operated under a unique system of maritime democracy. Captains were elected by the crew and could be deposed just as easily. They held absolute power during battle, but in peacetime, major decisions were made by majority vote. It was a delicate balance, and Charles Vane was catastrophically bad at maintaining it. The breaking point came in November of 1718. Vane's ship encountered a French man-of-war, a powerful warship bristling with cannon and manned by disciplined naval personnel. When the French ship challenged them, Vane made a decision that would define his legacy and create an opportunity for Jack Rackham. He chose to run. Now, retreating from a superior force is often the wise choice. A dead pirate captures no prizes and earns no plunder. But the way Vane handled the retreat struck his crew as cowardly. Instead of explaining his tactical reasoning or putting the decision to a vote, he simply ordered the ship to flee without consultation. To the crew, this smacked of the kind of autocratic leadership they had joined piracy to escape. The tension that had been building for months finally exploded. The crew, led by none other than Jack Rackham, called for a vote of no confidence in their captain. It was a dramatic confrontation that would be remembered in pirate lore for generations. Picture the scene, the ship anchored in a secluded cove, the entire crew gathered on deck under the blazing Caribbean sun. Charles Vane standing defiant as his authority crumbled around him. And Jack Rackham, resplendent in his colourful calico coat, making the case for new leadership. The vote was swift and decisive. Charles Vane was deposed, and in his place, the crew elected Jack Rackham as their new captain. It was a pivotal moment that transformed Rackham from follower to leader, from crew member to captain. But it also revealed something crucial about his character. Unlike Vane, who had ruled through fear and intimidation, Rackham had won over the crew through persuasion and charisma. He understood that true leadership in the pirate world required not just courage in battle, but political skill in peacetime. The transition of power was handled with surprising civility. Rather than executing Vane or marooning him on a deserted island, as might have happened under a more vindictive leader, Rackham chose a more pragmatic approach. Vane and his remaining loyal supporters were given a smaller vessel and allowed to sail away. It was a decision that demonstrated both Rackham's confidence in his new position and his understanding that mercy could be just as powerful as cruelty in building a reputation. With Charles Vane gone and Jack Rackham firmly established as captain, the crew found themselves with a new kind of leader. Where Vane had been harsh and unpredictable, Rackham was charming and calculating. He understood that a pirate captain's greatest asset was not his sword arm or his knowledge of seamanship, though both were important. His greatest asset was his ability to inspire loyalty and maintain morale among a crew of rough, dangerous men who had chosen a life outside the law. Rackham's approach to leadership was revolutionary in its simplicity. He treated his crew as partners rather than subordinates. He consulted them on major decisions, shared information about potential targets, and most importantly, he made sure everyone received their fair share of any plunder they captured. This wasn't altruism, it was shrewd leadership. A crew that felt valued and respected was a crew that would fight harder and remain loyal longer. But leadership style alone doesn't make a legend. To truly understand how Jack Rackham became Calico Jack, we need to examine his approach to the actual business of piracy, and it was here that his theatrical instincts truly shone. Rackham understood that piracy was as much about psychology as it was about seamanship or swordplay. The goal was not necessarily to fight, but to win without fighting. And the key to winning without fighting was reputation. Every aspect of Rackham's operation was designed for maximum psychological impact. His personal flag, the famous Jolly Roger that would later inspire countless imitations, featured a skull above two crossed cutlasses. It was simple, memorable, and unmistakably threatening. When merchant sailors saw that flag approaching, they knew exactly what they were dealing with. More importantly, they knew that resistance would likely be futile and potentially fatal. The colourful calico clothing served a similar purpose. In an age before photography or mass media, personal appearance was one of the few ways to create a lasting impression. Rackham's flamboyant dress sense made him instantly recognisable and utterly unforgettable. Merchants who survived an encounter with Calico Jack would spread word of the pirate in the bright, patterned coat. The stories would grow in the telling, as stories always do, and soon Jack Rackham's reputation began to take on a life of its own. This calculated approach to image building extended to every aspect of his piracy. When Rackham's crew captured a vessel, they did so with theatrical flair. They would swoop down on their prey like actors taking the stage, all swagger and bravado. Rackham himself would often lead the boarding party, his colourful coat billowing in the wind, his cutlass gleaming in the tropical sun. It was a performance designed to demoralise the enemy and energise his own crew. But beneath the theatrical exterior lay a sharp tactical mind. Rackham was careful to choose his targets wisely. He preferred smaller, lightly armed merchant vessels over heavily defended treasure galleons. He understood that consistent small victories were more valuable than one glorious defeat. His crew needed regular success to maintain their morale and their loyalty. Better to capture a dozen modest prizes than to lose everything in pursuit of one spectacular score. This pragmatic approach to piracy served Rackham well in the early months of his captaincy. His crew captured vessel after vessel, always with minimal bloodshed and maximum profit. Word of their success spread throughout the Caribbean, attracting new recruits and enhancing their fearsome reputation. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Jack Rackham had discovered the secret to sustainable piracy. But success in the pirate world was always precarious. The very factors that made piracy attractive, the freedom and the potential for wealth, also made it incredibly dangerous. Colonial governors were offering bounties for pirate captains. The Royal Navy was increasing its patrols. And most dangerous of all, other pirates were beginning to take notice of Calico Jack's success. It was during this period of growing success and mounting danger that Jack Rackham made a decision that would forever cement his place in pirate legend. But this decision had nothing to do with treasure or battle tactics. Instead, it involved matters of the heart, and it would lead to one of the most scandalous episodes in the entire golden age of piracy. The story begins in the bustling port of Nassau in the Bahamas, the unofficial capital of the Pirate Republic. Nassau was a place unlike anywhere else on Earth, a lawless haven where pirates could sell their plunder, repair their ships, and enjoy the fruits of their criminal labor without fear of arrest. The streets were filled with rough men spending their ill-gotten gains on rum, gambling, and other pleasures. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single night, where violence lurked around every corner, and where the only law was the law of the strongest. Into this chaotic world walked a woman who would change Jack Rackham's life forever. Her name was Bonny, and she was unlike any woman of her time. Born in Ireland and raised in the American colonies, Anne had grown up in a world that offered women few choices and fewer freedoms. Society expected her to marry well, bear children, and live a quiet life of domestic obedience. But Bonny was not a woman who accepted limitations easily. When we first encounter Anne in the historical record, she is already married to a small-time pirate named James Bonny. But this marriage was more a matter of convenience than love. James Bonny was a weak man, content to live off the scraps of more successful pirates. He had married Anne, hoping to gain access to her father's wealth, but when her father disowned her for the marriage, James found himself with a wife who was far more ambitious and dangerous than he had bargained for. Anne Bonny was a woman of fierce independence and fiery temperament. She was known to carry a pistol and knew how to use it. Stories circulated through Nassau of her violent confrontations with anyone who dared to cross her. She was beautiful, dangerous, and utterly uninterested in playing the role of a dutiful pirate's wife. When she met Jack Rackham in a Nassau tavern sometime in 1719, the attraction was immediate and electric. Here was a woman who matched Rackham's own theatrical nature, someone who understood that life was meant to be lived boldly and without apology. And here was a man who saw in Anne not just a beautiful woman, but a kindred spirit who shared his rejection of society's constraints. Their romance was passionate, public, and completely scandalous by the standards of the time. But this was more than just a love affair. Anne Bonny's involvement with Jack Rackham would transform both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. You see, Anne had no intention of remaining on shore while her lover sailed off on adventures. She demanded to join his crew, to become a pirate in her own right. It was an unprecedented request that challenged every convention of the age. Women aboard pirate ships were generally forbidden. The ship's articles that governed most pirate crews specifically prohibited bringing women on board, not out of any sense of propriety, but because of the practical problems they could cause. In the cramped, all-male environment of a pirate vessel, women were seen as a source of jealousy, fighting, and disruption. Most pirate captains would have laughed at such a request, or worse, seen it as a sign of weakness in their leader. But Jack Rackham was not most pirate captains. Perhaps it was his genuine love for Anne, or perhaps it was his recognition of her formidable capabilities. Whatever the reason, he agreed to take her aboard. It was a decision that would make their story legendary, but it was also a decision that revealed something crucial about Rackham's character. He was willing to break with tradition, to challenge expectations, and to risk his reputation for something he believed in. The logistics of bringing Anne aboard required careful planning. Women were not simply forbidden on pirate ships, they were illegal on most vessels of any kind during this period. Anne would need to disguise herself as a man, at least initially, to avoid detection by the crew and by any authorities they might encounter. She bound her chest, cut her hair, and adopted the rough clothing and swaggering walk of a male sailor. The deception was remarkably successful, at least at first. Anne proved to be a natural sailor, adapting quickly to life aboard ship. She was fearless in battle, skilled with both pistol and cutlass, and possessed a tactical mind that complemented Rackham's own strategic thinking. More importantly, she brought a new energy to the crew that enhanced their already formidable reputation. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in the close quarters of a pirate ship. It wasn't long before the truth about Anne's identity began to spread among the crew. The revelation could have been disastrous. Crews had been known to mutiny over far less serious violations of ship's articles. But once again, Jack Rackham's leadership skills proved crucial. Rather than trying to maintain the deception or remove Anne from the ship, Rackham chose a characteristically bold approach. He called the crew together and openly acknowledged Anne's true identity. But he presented it not as a violation of their rules, but as an enhancement to their capabilities. Here was a fighter as fierce as any man, a strategist as clever as their captain, and a symbol that their crew was so formidable that even the supposedly weaker sex could thrive among them. The crew's response was mixed, but ultimately accepting. Some were undoubtedly uncomfortable with the unprecedented situation, but most were won over by Anne's proven abilities and Rackham's confident handling of the situation. It helped that the crew was prospering under their captain's leadership. Success has a way of making people more tolerant of unconventional arrangements. News of Anne Bonny's presence aboard Calico Jack's ship spread throughout the Caribbean like wildfire. Here was a story that had everything: romance, rebellion, and the complete overturning of social conventions. Tavern tales grew in the telling, and soon Anne Bonny became as famous as her lover. She was described as a fierce warrior who fought alongside the men, a beautiful temptress who had seduced a pirate captain, and a dangerous criminal who had abandoned all pretense of feminine virtue. But the story was about to become even more extraordinary, because Anne Bonny was not the only woman who would join Jack Rackham's crew. In another twist that seems almost too incredible for fiction, fate would soon bring them another female pirate whose story was, if anything, even more remarkable than Anne's. Her name was Mary Read, and her path to piracy had been unlike anyone else's in the Golden Age. Mary had been born in England and raised as a boy from childhood. Her mother, left destitute by her husband's death, had disguised Mary as her deceased older brother in order to claim financial support from the boy's wealthy grandmother. What began as a desperate deception became Mary's entire life. Growing up as Mark read, Mary had served in the British military with distinction. She had fought in European wars, proven herself in battle, and earned the respect of her fellow soldiers. But military pay was poor, and opportunities for advancement were limited. Like so many others of her generation, Mary had eventually found her way to the Caribbean, where she joined a pirate crew while still maintaining her male disguise. The meeting between Anne Bonny and Mary Read aboard Jack Rackham's ship is one of the most fascinating encounters in pirate history. According to the trial records that would later document their crimes, Anne initially became attracted to the handsome young sailor she knew as Mark Read. The irony was delicious. A woman disguised as a man being pursued by another woman, disguised as a man, neither initially aware of the other's true identity. When the truth was finally revealed, it created a bond between the two women that was stronger than mere friendship. They had both chosen to reject the limitations society placed on their sex. They had both found freedom and purpose in the dangerous world of piracy. And they both served under a captain who was willing to accept them as equals regardless of their gender. With both Anne Bonny and Mary Read aboard his ship, Jack Rackham commanded perhaps the most unique pirate crew in history. The presence of two formidable female fighters enhanced their already fearsome reputation. Stories spread throughout the Caribbean of the pirate captain who sailed with warrior women, of battles where these women fought more fiercely than any man. The legend of Calico Jack was becoming something larger than life. But legends, as Jack Rackham would soon discover, cast long shadows. The more famous he became, the more attention he attracted from those who sought to end his career permanently. Colonial governors were under increasing pressure from London to eliminate piracy from Caribbean waters. The Royal Navy was deploying more ships and more aggressive tactics. And other pirates, jealous of Rackham's success and him as a threat to their own operations' notoriety, were beginning to see. The golden age of piracy was entering its final phase, and the forces that would ultimately bring it to an end were gathering strength. For Jack Rackham, sailing at the height of his fame, with two of the most remarkable women in pirate history at his side, the greatest challenges of his career still lay ahead. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything he had learned about leadership, loyalty, and survival in the unforgiving world of Caribbean piracy. The man who had built his reputation on theatrical flair and calculated risk-taking was about to face his greatest performance yet. And like all great dramas, this one would end with consequences that no one could have anticipated. The Caribbean in 1720 was a very different place than it had been just 2 years earlier. The wild, lawless frontier that had allowed pirates like Jack Rackham to flourish was slowly but inexorably being tamed. Colonial governments, backed by increasingly powerful naval forces, were tightening their grip on the sea lanes. The easy targets that had once made piracy so profitable were becoming harder to find, better defended, and more likely to fight back. For Calico Jack, these changes presented a dilemma that would test every skill he had developed as a leader. His crew expected the same level of success they had enjoyed in the past, but the opportunities for that success were rapidly diminishing. The delicate balance between risk and reward that had defined his approach to piracy was shifting, and not in his favor. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions. His crew, emboldened by their past successes and the presence of two formidable female fighters, was eager for action. Bonny and Mary Red had proven themselves in several engagements, their fierce fighting style and tactical acumen earning the respect of even the most skeptical crew members. But respect didn't fill the ship's treasury, and a successful pirate captain was measured ultimately by his ability to deliver plunder. Rackham found himself caught between the expectations of his crew and the harsh realities of a changing world. The small merchant vessels that had once been easy prey were now traveling in convoys, protected by armed escorts. The isolated settlements that had provided convenient targets for raids were now fortified and garrisoned with regular troops. Even the corrupt colonial officials, who had once turned a blind eye to pirate activities in exchange for a share of the profits, were becoming more cautious as pressure from London increased. It was during this period of mounting challenges that Jack Rackham made a series of decisions that would define his legacy. Rather than adapting his tactics to the new reality, he chose to double down on the theatrical approach that had brought him success in the past. If anything, he became more flamboyant, more daring, more willing to take risks that a more cautious captain might have avoided. This wasn't necessarily poor judgment. Rackham understood that his reputation was his most valuable asset, and that reputation required constant reinforcement. A pirate captain who appeared weak or hesitant would quickly find his crew looking for new leadership. The democratic nature of pirate society meant that captains served at the pleasure of their crews, and crews had little patience for leaders who couldn't deliver results. So when opportunities for prizes became scarce, Rackham created his own opportunities. He began targeting vessels that other pirate captains might have considered too dangerous or too well defended. He launched raids on settlements that prudent pirates would have avoided, and he did it all with the same theatrical flair that had made him famous, leading from the front with his colourful coat billowing in the wind and his cutlass flashing in the sun. These bold actions had their intended effect on crew morale. The men who served under Calico Jack saw their captain as fearless, a leader who would never ask them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. Bonny and Mary Red proved invaluable during these increasingly dangerous operations, their skill in combat and their tactical intelligence helping to turn potentially disastrous encounters into narrow victories. But success built on ever-increasing risk is inherently unsustainable. Each successful raid made the next one more difficult, as authorities increased patrols and fortified defenses. Each narrow escape used up a little more of the luck that all pirates depended on for survival. And each act of defiance against the growing power of colonial authority brought more attention from forces that Rackham was not equipped to handle. The beginning of the end came in the form of a man named Woodes Rogers, the newly appointed governor of the Bahamas. Rogers was not like the corrupt or incompetent officials who had previously held colonial positions in the Caribbean. He was a former privateer himself, a man who understood piracy from the inside and was therefore uniquely qualified to combat it. More importantly, he had been given unprecedented authority and resources by the British Crown to eliminate piracy from Bahamian waters. Rogers arrived in Nassau with a fleet of Royal Navy vessels and a clear mandate: offer pardons to pirates who surrendered and hunt down those who refused. It was a carrot and stick approach that had proven effective in other parts of the Caribbean. Many pirates, tired of the constant danger and diminishing returns of their profession, accepted the offered amnesty and retired to lives of relative obscurity. But Jack Rackham was not ready to retire. At the height of his fame, with two of the most notorious female pirates in history at his side, and a crew that had followed him through countless adventures, the idea of surrender was unthinkable. When Governor Rogers issued his ultimatum, Calico Jack's response was characteristically theatrical. He would continue sailing under the black flag, and anyone who tried to stop him would face the consequences. This defiant stance played well with his crew, but it also marked him as one of the most wanted men in the Caribbean. Rogers placed a substantial bounty on Rackham's head and dispatched his most capable officers to hunt him down. The net was closing, but Calico Jack seemed almost to relish the challenge. If anything, the increased danger only added to the theatrical drama that he had always loved. The cat and mouse game that followed was a masterclass in maritime maneuvering. Rackham used his intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters to stay one step ahead of his pursuers, ducking into hidden coves and using the complex geography of the islands to his advantage. His smaller, more maneuverable vessel could go places that the larger Royal Navy ships could not follow, and his crew's expertise in coastal navigation allowed them to disappear and reappear like ghosts. But this constant evasion came at a cost. The crew was under tremendous stress, always looking over their shoulders for pursuing sails. Opportunities for capturing prizes became even more limited as merchant shipping adapted to the increased naval presence, and the psychological pressure of being constantly hunted began to take its toll on even the most hardened pirates. It was during this period of intense pressure that the true character of Jack Rackham's crew was revealed. Lesser men might have abandoned their captain, accepted pardons, or simply melted away into the anonymity of legitimate seafaring. But the bonds that Rackham had forged through his democratic leadership style and his willingness to share both risks and rewards held firm. His crew remained loyal, even as the odds against them mounted. Anne Bonny and Mary Red proved particularly stalwart during these difficult times. Both women had already defied society's expectations simply by joining a pirate crew, and they were not about to be intimidated by increased danger. If anything, the heightened stakes seemed to energize them. They took on increasingly important roles in planning operations and managing crew morale, becoming true partners in leadership rather than merely skilled fighters. The psychological dynamics aboard Rackham's ship during this period were fascinating. The presence of two formidable women in leadership positions created a unique esprit de corps among the crew. These men had signed on to serve under a captain who was already unconventional in his methods and theatrical in his approach. The addition of female pirates to their number only reinforced their sense of being part of something extraordinary, a crew that operated by its own rules and defied every convention of the age. This sense of uniqueness became both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. It bonded the crew together and motivated them to extraordinary acts of courage and loyalty. But it also made them increasingly isolated from the broader community of Caribbean pirates. Other crews began to view them with suspicion, unsure how to relate to pirates who had abandoned so many of the traditional rules and customs of their profession. The isolation was compounded by the growing effectiveness of Governor Rogers' campaign. One by one, other pirate captains were either accepting pardons or being captured. The network of friendly ports and corrupt officials that had once supported pirate operations was being systematically dismantled. Nassau, the great pirate haven, was now firmly under government control. The golden age of piracy was entering its final phase, and Calico Jack found himself among the last holdouts of a dying era. But rather than adapting to these new realities, Rackham seemed determined to go out in a blaze of glory. His operations became even more audacious, his theatrical gestures even more flamboyant. He began attacking targets that were increasingly well defended, taking risks that bordered on the suicidal. It was as if he understood that the end was inevitable and was determined to make it as memorable as possible. This fatalistic approach to piracy had its own strange logic. Rackham had built his entire reputation on being larger than life, on being the kind of pirate that people would remember and talk about for generations. A quiet retirement or an ignominious capture would have been completely at odds with the persona he had so carefully constructed. Better to burn brightly and briefly than to fade away into obscurity. The crew seemed to understand and accept this logic. They had signed on for adventure, for the chance to live a life free from the constraints of ordinary society. The increasing danger was simply the price of that freedom, and they were willing to pay it. The presence of Bonny and Mary Read, two women who had already sacrificed everything for the pirate life, served as a constant reminder of what they were all fighting for. As 1720 progressed, the pressure continued to mount. Royal Navy patrols became more frequent and more sophisticated in their tactics. The few remaining pirate-friendly ports became increasingly dangerous as government agents and bounty hunters proliferated. The easy targets that had once sustained pirate operations became virtually extinct as merchant shipping adapted to the new security environment. Yet through it all, Calico Jack maintained his theatrical persona. His colourful calico coat became a symbol of defiance against the forces that sought to end the pirate era. His very appearance on the horizon was enough to cause panic among merchant sailors and to inspire his own crew to acts of desperate courage. He had become something more than just a pirate captain. He had become a living legend, the embodiment of everything that the golden age of piracy represented. But legends, as Jack Rackham was about to discover, are mortal. The combination of increased pressure from authorities, diminishing opportunities for success, and his own refusal to adapt to changing circumstances was creating a perfect storm that would soon test every aspect of his leadership and his character. The stage was being set for a final confrontation that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of the two remarkable women who had chosen to cast their lots with his. The autumn of 1720 found Calico Jack's crew operating in increasingly desperate circumstances. Their ship needed repairs, their supplies were running low, and their options for safe harbour were virtually non-existent. Every decision carried enormous risks, and every day brought them closer to the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. It was in this context of mounting pressure and diminishing options that Jack Rackham would face the greatest test of his career as a pirate captain. The skills that had brought him success in easier times would now be pushed to their absolute limits. His ability to inspire loyalty, to make tactical decisions under pressure, and to maintain the theatrical persona that had made him famous would all be put to the ultimate test. The man who had built his reputation on style and showmanship was about to discover whether substance could match spectacle when everything was on the line. The real Jack, who had inspired the fictional Jack Sparrow, was approaching the climactic moment of his extraordinary career, and neither he nor his legendary crew could know what the outcome would be. The confrontation that would define Jack Rackham's legacy began not with the thunder of cannon fire, but with something far more mundane: a shortage of fresh water. By October of 1720, His ship's barrels were nearly empty, and the crew was reduced to rationing their meagre supplies. The constant evasion of Royal Navy patrols had prevented them from making port for resupply, and the tropical heat made their situation increasingly desperate. It was Bonny who first suggested the solution that would lead to their downfall. She had grown up in these waters and knew of small settlements along the Jamaican coast where fresh water could be obtained without alerting the authorities. These were places too small and remote to maintain regular garrisons, populated by fishermen and small farmers who might be willing to trade with pirates if the price was right. The plan seemed sound enough. They would approach under cover of darkness, send a small party ashore to negotiate for supplies, and be gone before dawn. It was the kind of low-risk operation that Rackham had perfected in his earlier career. But the Caribbean of 1720 was not the Caribbean of 1718, and what should have been a routine resupply mission was about to become a trap. Unknown to Rackham and his crew, Governor Rogers had established a network of informants throughout the region. Even the most remote settlements had been provided with means of communication, and substantial rewards were offered for information leading to the capture of wanted pirates. The very isolation that made these communities attractive to desperate pirates also made them perfect locations for ambushes. On the night of October 20th, 1720, Calico Jack's ship glided silently into a Awa's dark, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant cry Small Bay on the north coast of Jamaica, the moon of night birds. Rackham stood at the bow, his colourful coat replaced by darker clothing, more suitable for a covert operation. Even in these desperate circumstances, he maintained the careful attention to detail that had always characterised his leadership. The landing party consisted of Rackham himself, Bonny, Mary Reed, and 6 of his most trusted crew members. They rowed ashore in the ship's longboat, their weapons muffled to prevent any telltale sounds from carrying across the water. The plan was simple: locate the settlement's headman, negotiate for water and supplies, and return to the ship before sunrise. But as they pulled their boat up onto the sandy beach, none of them realized they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The settlement's lookouts had spotted their approach hours earlier, and word had already been sent to the nearest Royal Navy station. Captain Jonathan Barnett, one of Governor Rogers' most effective pirate hunters, was already en route with a well-armed sloop and a crew of experienced Marines. The first sign of trouble came not from the sea, but from the settlement itself. As Rackham's party approached the cluster of small buildings that constituted the village, they found the streets eerily empty. Windows that should have shown the warm glow of lamplight were dark and shuttered. Even the dogs that typically prowled such settlements were nowhere to be seen. Mary Red was the first to sense the danger. Her military experience had taught her to recognize the signs of an ambush, and everything about this situation felt wrong. She caught Anne's eye and made a subtle hand signal that had become part of their private communication system. Something was not right here. But before they could retreat, the trap was sprung. From the shadows of the buildings stepped a dozen armed men, their muskets trained on the pirate landing party. These were not local militia or hastily assembled volunteers. These were professional Marines, disciplined and well-trained, led by an officer whose voice carried the unmistakable authority of the Royal Navy. The standoff that followed was a tense affair. Rackham found himself face to face with Lieutenant Governor Sir Nicholas Laws's personal representative, a man who had been specifically tasked with bringing the notorious Calico Jack to justice. The officer was courteous but firm. Surrender now, and the crew would be treated according to the laws of war. Resist, and no quarter would be given. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Jack Rackham weighed his options. He could surrender and face almost certain execution, but perhaps save the lives of his crew. He could fight and likely die on this anonymous beach, far from the theatrical stage he had always imagined for his final performance. Or he could attempt to negotiate, using the skills that had served him so well in the past. It was Bonny who made the decision for him. With a fierce cry that echoed across the water, she drew her pistol and fired at the nearest Marine. The shot went wide, but it shattered the tense silence and transformed the standoff into a running battle. Mary Read was only seconds behind her, her own weapon barking flame and smoke in the darkness. What followed was a chaotic fighting retreat toward the beach. The Marines had superior numbers and position, but the pirates had desperation and the advantage of knowing their escape route. Rackham found himself caught up in the kind of close-quarters combat that he had always tried to avoid through clever tactics and intimidation. The battle was brief but vicious. Musket balls whined through the air, illuminated by muzzle flashes that turned the peaceful beach into a hellscape of smoke and fire. 2 of Rackham's crew fell in the first exchange, their bodies crumpling onto the sand that was already being stained with blood. But the pirates' greatest disadvantage was not the enemy's superior firepower or numbers. It was the fact that their escape route was already compromised. As they fought their way toward the longboat, the unmistakable sound of cannon fire echoed across the water. Their ship, left with only a skeleton crew, was under attack by Captain Barnett's sloop. The realization that they were trapped galvanized the remaining pirates into a fury of desperate combat. Bonny fought like a woman possessed, her cutlass weaving a deadly pattern that kept multiple Marines at bay. Mary Read, drawing on her military training, organized a fighting withdrawal that probably saved several lives. And Jack Rackham, perhaps for the first time in his career, found himself fighting not for plunder or glory, but for simple survival. The fighting retreat reached the water's edge just as the longboat exploded in a shower of splinters. A lucky shot from one of the Marines had found their escape vessel, leaving them stranded on the beach with nowhere to run. The trap was complete, and even Calico Jack's legendary luck had finally run out. The final moments of the battle were almost anticlimactic. Surrounded and outnumbered, with their ship under attack and their escape route destroyed, the surviving pirates had no choice but to surrender. One by one, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands in defeat. The golden age of piracy had claimed another victim, and Jack Rackham's theatrical career was about to enter its final act. As the smoke cleared and the Marines moved in to secure their prisoners, Captain Barnett surveyed his prize with satisfaction. He had captured one of the most notorious pirate captains in the Caribbean, along with 2 of the most famous female pirates in history. The bounty on their heads would make him a wealthy man, and their capture would be celebrated throughout the British Empire. But even in defeat, Jack Rackham maintained the theatrical instincts that had defined his career. As the Marines bound his hands and prepared him for transport, he straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin with defiant pride. His colourful coat was torn and stained with blood and smoke, but he wore it like a royal robe. If this was to be his final performance, he would make it memorable. The capture of Calico Jack and his crew sent shockwaves throughout the Caribbean. Here was proof that even the most successful and notorious pirates were not beyond the reach of colonial justice. The network of informants and the coordinated efforts of the Royal Navy were beginning to show results, and the few remaining pirate captains took note. Bonny and Mary Read faced a particularly uncertain future. Female pirates were almost unheard of, and there was no established precedent for how they should be treated by the colonial justice system. Their very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, crime, and society. Their trials would become as much about social order as about piracy. As the prisoners were loaded aboard Captain Barnett's vessel for transport to Spanish town Jamaica, where they would face trial, Jack Rackham found himself reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this point. He had sought freedom from the constraints of ordinary society, and he had found it, at least for a while. He had built a reputation that would outlive him, created legends that would inspire stories for generations to come. The irony was not lost on him that his capture had come not through any grand naval battle or heroic last stand, but through the mundane necessity of seeking fresh water. It was a reminder that even the most theatrical lives are ultimately governed by basic human needs and limitations. The legend of Calico Jack had been built on spectacle and showmanship, but it was ending with the simple reality of thirst and desperation. During the voyage to Spanish Town, Rackham had time to consider his legacy. He had achieved something that few pirates ever managed. He had become larger than life. His name would be remembered long after more successful but less colourful pirates were forgotten. The stories of his exploits would grow in the telling, becoming the foundation for countless tales of maritime adventure. More importantly, he had proven that leadership in the pirate world required more than just skill with weapons or knowledge of seamanship. It required an understanding of human nature, an ability to inspire loyalty and maintain morale under the most difficult circumstances. The democratic ideals that governed pirate society demanded leaders who could persuade rather than simply command, and Rackham had excelled at this delicate balance. His relationship with Bonny and Mary Read had demonstrated that even the most unconventional arrangements could work if they were based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The three of them had created something unprecedented in the masculine world of piracy, a partnership that transcended traditional gender roles and social expectations. As the ship carrying them to trial cut through the Caribbean waters, Jack Rackham knew that his days of freedom were over. The colonial justice system showed little mercy to pirates, and his reputation would work against him in court. He would likely face the gallows within a matter of weeks. But he also knew that his story was far from over. The trial that awaited him would be a public spectacle, an opportunity for one final theatrical performance. The testimony would be recorded, the proceedings would be reported in newspapers throughout the British Empire, and the legend of Calico Jack would be preserved for posterity. In a sense, his capture was simply the beginning of his transformation from historical figure to enduring myth. The influence of Jack Rackham's story would extend far beyond the golden age of piracy. His combination of theatrical flair, democratic leadership, and romantic entanglements would become the template for fictional pirates in literature and eventually in film. The real Jack would inspire countless fictional Jacks, each one carrying forward some element of his personality and approach to life. But that transformation from history to legend still lay in the future. For now, as the ship approached the harbours of Jamaica, Jack Rackham was simply a captured pirate facing the ultimate consequences of his choices. The man who had lived his entire career as a performance was about to give his final show, and he was determined to make it worthy of the reputation he had spent years building. The stage was set for the last act of Calico Jack's remarkable career, and the audience would include not just the colonial officials who would judge him, but history itself. The real pirate who had inspired Jack Sparrow was about to face the most important performance of his life, and the outcome would determine how he would be remembered for generations to come. The trial of John Rackham, known throughout the Caribbean as Calico Jack, opened on November 16, 1720, in the courthouse of Spanish Town, Jamaica. The building itself seemed designed to intimidate, its imposing stone walls and high windows creating an atmosphere of solemn judgment. But if the colonial authorities expected their notorious prisoner to be cowed by the formal proceedings, they had seriously underestimated the man who had built his entire career on commanding attention. Rackham entered the courtroom as if he were taking the stage for a grand performance. Despite weeks in custody, despite the chains that bound his wrists, despite the grim knowledge of what awaited him, he carried himself with the same theatrical confidence that had made him famous. His calico coat had been replaced with simple prison garb, but he wore even these rough clothes with a dignity that commanded respect. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Word of the trial had spread throughout the colony, drawing curious onlookers who wanted to see the legendary pirate captain in person. Colonial officials sat in the front rows, their faces grave with the importance of the proceedings. Behind them, merchants and planters who had suffered from pirate attacks watched with barely concealed satisfaction. And in the back, common sailors and dockworkers observed with expressions that mixed fascination and sympathy. The charges against Rackham were read in the formal language of British law, but they told a story of adventure and rebellion that resonated far beyond the courthouse walls. Piracy, robbery on the high seas, and disturbing the peace of His Majesty's subjects. Each charge carried the death penalty, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses had testified to his crimes, and his own reputation served as proof of his guilt. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came not during the reading of charges or the presentation of evidence. It came when Bonny and Mary Red were brought into the courtroom. The sight of two women in chains, accused of piracy alongside their male companions, created a sensation that rippled through the packed gallery. Here was something unprecedented, something that challenged every assumption about crime and punishment in colonial society. Bonny met Jack Rackham's eyes across the courtroom, and for a moment the formal proceedings faded into the background. Here were two people who had chosen to live outside society's rules, who had found love and partnership in the most unlikely circumstances. Their relationship had scandalized the Caribbean, but it had also created something beautiful and unique in a world that rarely tolerated deviation from established norms. Mary Red stood beside Anne with the same military bearing that had served her well in both the army and on the pirate ship. She had spent her entire life defying expectations about what women could and should do, and even facing the gallows, she maintained the dignity and courage that had earned the respect of hardened pirates. Her very presence in the courtroom was a testament to the extraordinary possibilities that existed for those brave enough to seize them. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Witness after witness testified to the depredations of Calico Jack's crew, painting a picture of a criminal enterprise that had terrorized merchant shipping throughout the region. The prosecutor, a man named William Norris, presented Rackham not as a romantic figure, but as a dangerous criminal who had brought chaos and violence to peaceful waters. Yet even as the evidence mounted against him, Rackham maintained his composure. He listened to the testimony with the air of a man attending a play about someone else's life. When sailors described his theatrical entrances during attacks, when merchants recounted the terror inspired by his colourful appearance, when naval officers detailed the ingenious tactics he had used to evade capture, he seemed almost pleased by the attention. The defence, such as it was, focused not on denying the charges, but on placing them in context. Rackham's attorney, appointed by the court, argued that his client was a product of his times, a man who had turned to piracy because legitimate opportunities for advancement were denied to those of humble birth. It was a sympathetic portrayal, but one that carried little weight in a courtroom where justice was synonymous with protecting British commercial interests. The most poignant moment of the trial came when Rackham was finally allowed to speak in his own defence. He rose slowly, his chains clanking in the sudden silence of the courtroom. For a man who had built his reputation on words as much as deeds, this was his final opportunity to shape how he would be remembered. His speech was brief but memorable. He did not beg for mercy or express remorse for his crimes. Instead, he spoke of the choices that had led him to piracy, of the harsh conditions that drove ordinary sailors to desperate measures. He acknowledged the harm his actions had caused, but he also defended the democratic ideals that had governed his crew. In a world where most men lived and died at the whim of their social betters, he had created a society where every voice mattered. Most remarkably, he spoke of Bonny and Mary Red with a respect and admiration that challenged every assumption about gender and authority. These women, he declared, had proven themselves the equal of any man in courage, intelligence, and loyalty. Their presence on his crew had not been a weakness or a distraction, but a source of strength that had enhanced their effectiveness as pirates. The judges deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was never in doubt, but the formal pronouncement still sent a chill through the courtroom. Guilty on all charges. Death by hanging. The sentence was to be carried out at Gallows Point in Port Royal, where the bodies would be left as a warning to other potential pirates. As the court officers moved to escort the prisoners back to their cells, Bonny managed to catch Rackham's attention one final time. The words she spoke to him would become part of pirate legend, a final exchange between lovers who had defied the world together. According to witnesses, she told him that if he had fought like a man, he would not have been hanged like a dog. It was a harsh judgment, but it came from someone who knew him better than anyone else. The execution of Jack Rackham took place on November 18th, 1720, just 2 days after his conviction. The site chosen for the hanging was symbolic as well as practical. Gallows Point was located at the entrance to Port Royal Harbour, where every ship entering or leaving would pass beneath the dangling bodies. It was a grim reminder of the fate that awaited those who chose piracy over legitimate trade. Despite the early hour, a large crowd gathered to witness the execution. Pirates had always been objects of fascination as well as fear, and the death of such a notorious figure drew spectators from throughout the colony. Some came out of curiosity, others out of a sense of justice finally being served, but many came to pay their respects to a man who had lived and died on his own terms. Rackham approached the gallows with the same theatrical dignity that had characterized his entire career. He was dressed in his finest clothes, the colourful calico coat that had given him his nickname cleaned and mended for the occasion. If this was to be his final performance, he was determined to make it memorable. The executioner's cart creaked to a halt beneath the wooden scaffold, and Rackham stepped down with steady composure. He was offered the traditional opportunity to address the crowd, and he used it to deliver what many witnesses described as the finest speech of his life. He spoke of the choices that had led him to piracy, of the brotherhood he had found among outcasts and rebels, and of the brief, brilliant freedom he had experienced sailing under the black flag. He made no apologies for his crimes, but he also expressed no hatred for those who had brought him to justice. He had lived by the sword and accepted that he would die by the rope. It was, he suggested, a fair exchange for the years of adventure and independence he had enjoyed. The crowd listened in respectful silence, many moved by the dignity with which he faced his fate. The actual hanging was swift and professional. The colonial authorities wanted no martyrdom, no lingering spectacle that might inspire sympathy for the condemned man. The rope was adjusted, the cart rolled away, and Jack Rackham's theatrical career came to an abrupt end. But even in death, he maintained the style that had made him famous, his colourful coat fluttering in the harbour breeze like a final defiant gesture. The fate of Bonny and Mary Read was more complex and, in some ways, more tragic. Both women claimed to be pregnant, a condition that under British law provided temporary reprieve from execution. Medical examinations confirmed their claims, and their sentences were commuted pending the birth of their children. It was a cruel twist of fate that gave them hope while condemning them to months of uncertainty. Mary Read would never live to see her child born. The harsh conditions of colonial imprisonment, combined with the stress of her situation, took a fatal toll on her health. She died in her cell in April of 1721, her body weakened by fever and despair. Her death was barely noted by the colonial press, a quiet end for a woman who had lived one of the most extraordinary lives of her age. Bonny's fate remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Some records suggest that she too died in prison, succumbing to disease or childbirth complications. Others hint that her wealthy father may have used his influence to secure her release, allowing her to disappear into anonymity. What we know for certain is that she vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only questions and speculation. The execution of Calico Jack marked the end of an era in Caribbean piracy. With his death, one of the last great pirate captains of the Golden Age was gone, and the colonial authorities had demonstrated their determination to stamp out maritime crime. The Royal Navy's increased presence and the network of informants established by governors like Woodes Rogers were proving effective in their campaign against piracy. But if the authorities hoped that Rackham's execution would end his influence, they were mistaken. His story began to spread almost immediately, carried by sailors and storytellers throughout the Atlantic world. The tale of the pirate in the colourful coat who sailed with two warrior women proved irresistible to popular imagination. Each telling embellished the details, added new elements, and transformed historical fact into enduring legend. The transformation was aided by the publication of Captain Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates in 1724. Johnson's account of Rackham's career, while generally accurate in its basic facts, emphasized the romantic and theatrical aspects of his story. The book portrayed him as a gentleman pirate, a man of style and substance who had chosen adventure over security. It was an image that would influence popular perception of pirates for centuries to come. More importantly, Johnson's book established the template that would eventually inspire fictional pirates from Robert Louis Stevenson's Long John Silver to Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow. The combination of roguish charm, democratic ideals, and romantic entanglements that characterized the real Jack Rackham became the standard formula for pirate heroes in literature and film. His influence on popular culture was just beginning. The democratic principles that had governed Rackham's crew also left their mark on history. The pirate articles that established equality among crew members, the system of elected leadership, and the fair distribution of plunder represented a radical experiment in maritime democracy. These ideas would influence political thinkers and revolutionaries in the decades that followed, contributing to broader movements for democratic reform. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read challenged conventional assumptions about gender and capability. Their success as pirates proved that women could excel in roles traditionally reserved for men, given the opportunity and encouragement. While their immediate impact was limited by the constraints of their time, their example would inspire future generations of women who sought to break free from social limitations. The real Jack Rackham had created something more lasting than any treasure he had ever captured. He had created a legend that would outlive empires and inspire countless stories of adventure and rebellion. The pirate in the colourful coat had become a symbol of freedom and individualism that would resonate across cultures and centuries. Standing at the gallows in Port Royal Harbour, facing his final moments with theatrical dignity, Jack Rackham could not have imagined the extent of his future influence. He could not have foreseen that his story would inspire novels, films, and television series. He could not have predicted that his approach to leadership and his relationship with his female crew members would become the standard template for fictional pirates. What he did understand was that he had lived a life worth remembering. In an age when most people lived and died in limitations, he had chosen a different path. He had seized control of his own destiny, created his own rules, and lived according to his own vision of what life should be. The price had been high, but the reward had been freedom itself. The golden age of piracy was ending, but the legend of Calico Jack was just beginning. The real pirate who had inspired Jack Sparrow had given his final performance, but his influence would continue to shape how we think about adventure obscurity, bound by social conventions, and economic rebellion, and the eternal human desire to live life on our own terms. Take what you can, give nothing back. Give. It was more than just a pirate motto. It was a philosophy of life that would inspire dreamers and rebels for generations to come. As the sun set over Port Royal Harbour on that November day in 1720, the age of the great pirate captains was drawing to a close. But the stories they had created, the legends they had built, and the dreams they had embodied would live on. Jack Rackham, known to history as Calico Jack, had achieved the immortality that only comes to those who dare to live extraordinarily. His theatrical career was over, but his greatest performance, his transformation into legend, was just beginning. The death of Calico Jack sent ripples throughout the pirate community that extended far beyond the Caribbean. In the rough taverns of Tortuga, the hidden coves of the Bahamas, and the shadowy ports where outlaws gathered to drink away their fears. Sailors spoke in hushed tones about the man who had dared to live so boldly and died so defiantly. His execution was more than just the end of one pirate's career, had all known was coming to an end. But it was a stark reminder that the golden age they legends, as we know, have a strange way of growing stronger in death than they ever were in life. Within months of his hanging, the story of Jack Rackham began to transform. The facts of his career, dramatic enough in their own right, became embellished with each telling. Sailors who had never met him claimed to have served under his command. Merchants who had never seen his ship swore they had witnessed his theatrical attacks. And storytellers in waterfront taverns began weaving tales that mixed truth with fiction in ways that made both more powerful. The transformation was not accidental. It was driven by a deep human need to believe that freedom was still possible, that authority could still be challenged, that ordinary people could still rise above their circumstances and live extraordinary lives. In an age of rigid social hierarchies and limited opportunities, the story of a man who had rejected all constraints and lived by his own rules offered hope to those who felt trapped by their circumstances. The process was accelerated by the unique nature of Rackham's story. Here was a pirate who had been as famous for his style as for his success. His colourful clothing, his democratic leadership, and his relationship with two remarkable women created a narrative that was rich with dramatic possibilities. It was a story that begged to be retold, embellished, and transformed into something larger than life. The colonial authorities, ironically, contributed to the legend they had hoped to destroy. By executing Rackham so publicly, by displaying his body as a warning to other potential pirates, they had inadvertently created a martyr. The sight of that colourful coat fluttering in the harbour breeze became a powerful symbol of defiance that would be remembered long after the body had crumbled to dust. More importantly, the authorities had failed to understand the psychological appeal of piracy to the common people of their time. They saw pirates simply as criminals who threatened trade and order. But to the sailors, servants, and labourers who made up the majority of colonial society, pirates represented something far more significant. They represented the possibility of escape from a system that offered little hope for advancement or improvement. This was particularly true in the case of Bonny and Mary Red. The mystery surrounding their ultimate fate only added to their legend. Were they dead, imprisoned, or had they somehow managed to escape? The uncertainty allowed people to imagine whatever ending they preferred. Some chose to believe they had died as martyrs to their cause. Others preferred to think they had found freedom and were living secretly somewhere beyond the reach of colonial justice. The ambiguity was perfect for legend making. Like the best mythological figures, Bonny and Mary Red became whatever people needed them to be. To some, they were tragic heroines who had died for love and freedom. To others, they were dangerous criminals who had gotten their just desserts. But to many women of their time, they were something far more revolutionary. They were proof that the limitations society placed on their sex were not immutable laws of nature, but arbitrary restrictions that could be challenged and overcome. The influence of their story would ripple forward through history in ways that would have astonished their contemporaries. In an age when women were expected to be silent and submissive, Bonny and Mary Red had spoken with their swords and commanded through their courage. They had proven that leadership was not determined by gender, that bravery was not a masculine trait, and that partnership between men and women could be based on equality rather than domination. But it was Jack Rackham himself who would have the most lasting impact on popular culture. His combination of theatrical flair and democratic ideals created a template for the heroic pirate that would influence storytellers for centuries. The real Jack had shown that a pirate captain could be more than just a brutal criminal. He could be a leader who inspired loyalty through respect rather than fear, who shared power rather than hoarding it, and who treated his crew as partners rather than subordinates. This vision of enlightened piracy was, of course, largely romanticized. The reality of life aboard most pirate ships was harsh, dangerous, and often short. But Rackham had demonstrated that it was possible to create something better, to build a society that operated on principles of fairness and mutual respect, even in the most lawless environment. It was this possibility, more than any treasure he had captured, that made his story so compelling. The literary transformation began almost immediately. Broadsheet ballads celebrating his exploits appeared in London coffeehouses within months of his death. These crude verses, sold for pennies to a public hungry for sensational stories, established the basic elements of the Calico Jack legend. He was portrayed as a gentleman pirate, a man of honor who had chosen adventure over security and freedom over safety. The ballads emphasized his gallant treatment of prisoners, his fair dealing with his crew, and his romantic relationship with the fierce Bonny. They glossed over the violence and criminality inherent in piracy, focusing instead on the aspects of his story that appealed to popular imagination. It was the beginning of a process that would eventually transform pirates from historical criminals into romantic heroes. The transformation was aided by the changing political climate of the early 18th century. The execution of Calico Jack coincided with growing tensions between Britain and its American colonies over issues of taxation and self-governance. To colonists who were beginning to chafe under imperial control, the story of pirates who had rejected royal authority and created their own democratic societies took on new significance. Pirates began to be seen not just as criminals, but as early rebels against tyranny. Their rejection of monarchical authority and their embrace of democratic principles made them attractive symbols for those who were beginning to question the legitimacy of imperial rule. The pirate articles that had governed crews like Rackham's were studied by political theorists as examples of practical democracy in action. This political dimension would become even more pronounced in the decades that followed. As the American colonies moved toward revolution, the example of pirate democracy would be cited by those who argued that ordinary people were capable of governing themselves. The idea that a crew of rough sailors could elect their own leaders and make collective decisions challenged the fundamental assumptions of monarchical government. The influence was not limited to politics. The story of Jack Rackham and his crew also contributed to changing ideas about social mobility and individual achievement. In an age when birth largely determined destiny, pirates represented the radical notion that anyone could rise to positions of leadership and authority through their own efforts. The fact that Rackham had started as an ordinary sailor and risen to command his own ship inspired those who felt trapped by their circumstances. This theme of self-made success would become increasingly important as the 18th century progressed and new ideas about individual rights and opportunities began to take hold. The pirate captain who had risen from humble origins to command respect and loyalty became a powerful symbol of the possibilities inherent in a more open society. The romantic elements of Rackham's story also contributed to changing ideas about love and marriage. His relationship with Bonny challenged conventional notions about the proper roles of men and women in romantic partnerships. Here was a love story based on mutual respect and shared adventure rather than economic necessity or social convention. It suggested that true partnership between the sexes was not only possible, but could be the source of extraordinary achievement. The fact that Bonny had abandoned a conventional marriage to join Rackham's crew added another layer of meaning to their story. It suggested that women, like men, were capable of choosing their own destinies, and that love based on genuine compatibility was superior to marriages arranged for financial or social advantage. These were radical ideas that would influence romantic literature for generations to come. As the 18th century progressed, the story of Calico Jack began to appear in more sophisticated forms of literature. Novelists and playwrights discovered in his career a rich source of dramatic material that could be adapted to explore themes of freedom, love, and social rebellion. The basic elements of his story, the theatrical pirate captain, the democratic crew, the warrior women, provided a framework that could support complex narratives about human nature and social organization. The process of literary transformation was gradual but inexorable. Each retelling of the story added new elements, emphasized different aspects, and adapted the basic narrative to contemporary concerns and interests. The historical Jack Rackham slowly gave way to a more mythological figure who embodied the eternal human desire for freedom and adventure. This mythological Jack was simultaneously more and less than his historical counterpart. He was more in that he came to represent universal human aspirations for independence and self-determination. He was less in that the complex realities of his actual life, the moral ambiguities of his choices, and the genuine hardships of his existence were gradually smoothed away in favor of a more palatable romantic ideal. The transformation was completed by the publication of Captain Charles Johnson's comprehensive account of P.I.'s work, while generally fact-rate careers in 1724. Johnsonial, in its basic outline, emphasized the romantic and adventurous aspects of pirate life while downplaying its more brutal realities. His portrayal of Jack Rackham established the template that would influence all subsequent depictions of the character. Johnson's Rackham was a gentleman pirate, a man of education and refinement who had chosen piracy not out of desperation, but out of a love of freedom and adventure. He was gallant to his prisoners, fair to his crew, and devoted to his remarkable female companions. It was a portrayal that bore some resemblance to the historical figure, but emphasized only those aspects that would appeal to readers looking for exciting entertainment rather than grim reality. The success of Johnson's book ensured that this romanticized version of Jack Rackham would become the standard portrayal. Future writers would draw on Johnson's account, adding their own embellishments and interpretations, but maintaining the basic characterization he had established. The real Jack Rackham was disappearing into history, while the legendary Calico Jack was being born into popular culture. The influence of this legendary figure would extend far beyond literature, as the story of Calico Jack spread throughout the Atlantic world. It began to influence how people thought about leadership, democracy, and individual rights. The example of a pirate captain who had governed through consent rather than coercion provided a powerful alternative to traditional models of authority based on birth or appointment from above. This was particularly significant in the American colonies, where growing tensions with Britain were raising fundamental questions about the source and limits of governmental authority. The example of pirate crews who elected their own leaders and made collective decisions about important issues offered a practical demonstration that democratic governance was not only possible, but could be effective even under the most challenging circumstances. The influence would become even more pronounced as the colonies moved toward independence. The democratic ideals that had governed pirate crews like Rackham's would be incorporated into revolutionary thinking about how free societies should organize themselves. The notion that legitimate authority derived from the consent of the governed, rather than from divine right or hereditary privilege, owed something to the example of pirate democracy. But perhaps the most lasting influence of Jack Rackham's story was on popular conceptions of heroism itself. The traditional hero of earlier literature had been a figure of noble birth who achieved great deeds through divine favor or inherited virtue. Rackham represented a new kind of hero, one who achieved greatness through his own efforts and who remained connected to the common people from whom he had risen. This democratic conception of heroism would become increasingly important as societies became more egalitarian and opportunities for advancement became more widely available. The self-made hero who achieved success through courage, intelligence, and determination became a more appealing figure than the aristocratic hero who succeeded primarily through the accident of birth. The story of Calico Jack also contributed to changing ideas about the relationship between law and morality. The historical Rackham had been, by any legal definition, a criminal whose activities caused real harm to innocent people. But the legendary figure that emerged from his story was portrayed as a man loyal to his friends, fair to his crew, who operated by his own moral code, who was, and gallant to his enemies. This portrayal suggested that legal and moral authority were not necessarily identical, that it was possible for someone to be outside the law while still maintaining personal honor and ethical standards. It was a notion that would prove attractive to future generations of rebels and revolutionaries who found themselves in conflict with established authority. The transformation of Jack Rackham from historical figure to cultural icon was complete by the middle of the 18th century. The man who had lived and died as a pirate captain had become something far more significant. He had become a symbol of human potential, a representation of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose upon them. This symbolic Jack Rackham would continue to evolve and adapt to changing times and circumstances. Each generation would rediscover his story and find in it reflections of their own struggles and aspirations. The democratic ideals he represented would inspire political reformers. The romantic elements of his story would influence writers and artists. And the simple fact that he had dared to live extraordinarily would continue to inspire those who felt trapped by ordinary circumstances. The real Jack Rackham had been dead for decades, his body long since crumbled to dust in the Caribbean sun. But Calico Jack, the legendary figure born from his story, was more alive than ever. He had achieved the kind of immortality that comes only to those whose lives transcend their historical moment and speak to universal human experiences and aspirations. Standing on that scaffold in Port Royal Harbour, facing his final moments with characteristic theatrical dignity, Jack Rackham could not have imagined the extent of his future influence. He could not have foreseen that his story would outlast the empire that had executed him, that his ideals would influence the founding of new nations, or that his approach to leadership and partnership would become the template for countless fictional heroes. But perhaps, in some way, he had understood that he was creating something more lasting than any treasure he might have captured. By choosing to live boldly, by treating his crew as equals, by embracing the remarkable women who had chosen to share his adventures, he had created a story worth remembering. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest treasure of all. The legend of Calico Jack was spreading across the Atlantic world, carried by sailors and storytellers who understood that some stories are too important to be forgotten. The real pirate who had inspired Jack Sparrow had given his final performance, but his influence was just beginning to be felt. Take what you can, give nothing back. It was more than a motto now. It had become a philosophy that would inspire dreamers and rebels for centuries to come. The influence of Jack Rackham's legend reached its full flowering in the literature of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But it was Robert Louis Stevenson who would complete the transformation from historical pirate to enduring cultural icon. When Stevenson sat down to write Treasure Island in 1881, he drew heavily on the romanticized accounts of Golden Age pirates that had been circulating for more than a century. But it was specifically the legend of Calico Jack that provided the template for what would become the definitive fictional pirate. Long John Silver, Stevenson's memorable creation, embodied all the characteristics that had made the legendary Jack Rackham so appealing. He was charming and intelligent, capable of inspiring fierce loyalty among his followers. He possessed a theatrical flair that made him memorable and commanding. Most importantly, he operated by his own moral code, one that valued loyalty and courage above legal compliance. Silver was a criminal, certainly, but he was also a leader who understood that true authority came from earning respect rather than demanding submission. The parallels between Silver and the legendary Rackham were not coincidental. Stevenson had grown up reading the romanticized accounts of pirate adventures that had been popular throughout the 19th century. These stories, all ultimately traceable back to the historical Jack Rackham, had established the template for what readers expected from a pirate hero. Stevenson simply refined and perfected the formula, creating a character who would define popular perceptions of pirates for generations to come. But Stevenson's contribution went beyond simply creating a memorable character. Treasure Island established many of the conventions that would dominate pirate fiction thereafter. The democratic crew making collective decisions, the treasure map marking a secret location, the exotic tropical setting where civilized rules no longer applied. All of these elements had roots in the stories that had grown up around historical pirates like Jack Rackham. The success of Treasure Island ensured that these conventions would become standard elements of adventure fiction. Future writers would return again and again to the formula Stevenson had perfected, creating variations on the theme but always maintaining the basic structure he had established. The influence of the historical Jack Rackham, filtered through more than a century of storytelling and literary refinement, had become the foundation of an entire genre. The transformation accelerated with the arrival of cinema in the early 20th century. Film provided a visual medium that was perfectly suited to the theatrical elements that had always been central to pirate stories. The colourful costumes, the dramatic sword fights, the exotic locations, all the elements that had made Jack Rackham's story so compelling could now be brought to vivid life on the silver screen. Early pirate films drew heavily on the established literary tradition, but they also added new elements that would become equally important to the genre. The swashbuckling hero, who could fence with extraordinary skill, swing from ropes with acrobatic grace, and deliver witty dialogue with perfect timing, became a standard figure in adventure cinema. These characters owed their existence to the long process of mythologization that had begun with the historical Jack Rackham's execution more than 2 centuries earlier. The cinematic pirate reached its full development in the films of Errol Flynn during the 1930s and 1940s. Flynn's Captain Blood and other characters embodied all the romantic ideals that had grown up around pirate figures. They were gentlemen adventurers who chose piracy not out of greed or desperation, but out of a love of freedom and excitement. They were gallant to women, loyal to friends, and honourable even in their criminal activities. Flynn's pirates were direct descendants of the legendary Calico Jack, though the connection had been obscured by decades of literary and cinematic evolution. The democratic ideals, the theatrical flair, the romantic entanglements, all the elements that had made Jack Rackham's story so compelling were still present, refined and polished, but fundamentally unchanged. The historical pirate had become the template for cinematic heroism. This template would prove remarkably durable. Even as cinema evolved and changed, the basic formula established by Flynn's pirate films remained popular with audiences. The heroic outlaw who lived by his own rules, who challenged authority through courage and wit rather than simple violence, who inspired loyalty through charisma rather than fear, continued to appear in film after film. The influence extended beyond pirate movies themselves. The swashbuckling hero became a standard figure in adventure cinema generally, appearing in westerns, war films, and science fiction movies. The characteristics that had made Jack Rackham legendary, his theatrical nature, his democratic leadership, his romantic partnerships, became standard elements of heroic characterization across multiple genres. But it was the Pirates of the Caribbean film series, beginning in 2003, that would complete the circle and bring the influence of Jack Rackham full circle. Johnny Depp's Captain Jack Sparrow was explicitly designed to embody all the romantic ideals that had grown up around pirate figures over the centuries. He was charming and unpredictable, theatrical and democratic, loyal to his friends and gallant to his enemies. More importantly, Sparrow's character incorporated many of the specific elements that had made the historical Jack Rackham so memorable. His distinctive appearance, designed to set him apart from ordinary sailors. His emphasis on style over substance, understanding that image was often more important than reality. His democratic approach to leadership, treating his crew as partners rather than subordinates. His complex romantic relationships with strong, independent women who were his equals in courage and determination. The creators of the Pirates of the Caribbean films acknowledged that they had drawn inspiration from historical pirates. But they may not have fully understood the extent to which they were recreating elements of Jack Rackham's actual story. The democratic crew meetings, the emphasis on personal freedom over material gain, the partnership with formidable women. All these elements had been part of Calico Jack's historical reality before they became part of his legend. Even Sparrow's famous motto, "Take what you can, give nothing back," while not a direct quotation from the historical Rackham, captured perfectly the spirit of defiance and independence that had characterized the real pirate's approach to life. It was a philosophy born from the harsh realities of 18th century maritime life, where survival often depended on seizing opportunities and refusing to surrender advantages once gained. The success of the Pirates of the Caribbean films introduced Jack Rackham's influence to a new generation of audiences who had no knowledge of the historical figure behind the fictional character they were enjoying. Captain Jack Sparrow became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring countless imitations and establishing pirate stories as one of the most popular forms of adventure entertainment. But the influence worked in both directions. The success of the films also renewed interest in historical piracy, leading many viewers to seek out information about the real pirates who had inspired the fictional characters they loved. This created a new audience for historical accounts of figures like Jack Rackham, Bonny, and Mary Read, ensuring that their actual stories would not be forgotten in the flood of fictional adaptations. The circle was complete. The historical Jack Rackham had inspired legends, which had influenced literature, which had shaped cinema, which had created characters who renewed interest in the historical figures who had started the entire process. The real pirate and his fictional descendants existed in a continuous loop of mutual influence and inspiration. This process revealed something profound about the relationship between history and popular culture. The stories we tell about the past are never simply objective accounts of what happened. They are always shaped by the needs and aspirations of the present, by what we want to believe about human potential and the possibilities for individual achievement. Jack Rackham's story had been so compelling not because he was the most successful pirate or the most feared, but because he had embodied ideals that resonated across cultures and centuries. His democratic leadership, his theatrical flair, his romantic partnerships, his refusal to accept the limitations that society tried to impose. All these elements spoke to universal human desires for freedom, respect, and the opportunity to live extraordinarily. The transformation of his story from historical fact to cultural myth demonstrated the power of narrative to shape human understanding and aspiration. The real Jack Rackham had lived a remarkable life, but the legendary Calico Jack had become something even more significant. He had become a symbol of human potential, a representation of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept ordinary limitations. This symbolic power explained why pirate stories continued to fascinate audiences centuries after the historical Golden Age had ended. They offered a vision of life lived on different terms, where success was measured not by social position or accumulated wealth, but by courage, loyalty, and the willingness to take risks for the sake of freedom and adventure. The democratic ideals that had governed Jack Rackham's crew also continued to influence political thinking in subtle but important ways. The notion that authority should derive from consent rather than coercion, that leaders should be chosen for their abilities rather than their birth, that important decisions should involve those who would be affected by them. All these ideas had been demonstrated in practice by pirate crews like Rackham's decades before they became foundational principles of modern democratic societies. The romantic elements of his story, particularly his partnerships with Bonny and Mary Read, had similarly influenced changing ideas about gender roles and relationships. The example of women who had proven themselves equal to men in courage, intelligence, and leadership ability had challenged assumptions about female capabilities that persisted well into the modern era. These influences were often indirect and unacknowledged, transmitted through popular culture rather than political theory or academic study. but they were no less real for being subtle. The stories we tell ourselves about heroes and villains, about what is possible and what is admirable, shape our understanding of ourselves and our world in profound ways. Jack Rackham's greatest achievement was not any treasure he had captured or any battle he had won. It was the creation of a story that would outlast his own life and continue to inspire others long after the circumstances that had created it had passed into history. He had shown that it was possible to live boldly, to reject limitations, and to create something beautiful and meaningful, even in the harshest circumstances. The man who had worn colourful calico coats to distinguish himself from ordinary sailors had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He had become truly unforgettable, his influence extending far beyond the Caribbean waters where he had sailed. The real Jack who had inspired the fictional Jack Sparrow had achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of gold could have purchased. As we look back across the centuries that separate us from the golden age of piracy, we can see how Jack Rackham's story has continued to evolve and adapt to changing times and circumstances. Each generation has found in his legend reflections of their own struggles and aspirations. The democratic ideals he embodied have inspired political reformers. The romantic elements of his story have influenced artists and writers. And the simple fact that he dared to live extraordinarily has continued to inspire those who refuse to accept ordinary limitations. The historical Jack Rackham lived for only about 30 years, and his career as a pirate captain lasted less than 2. But the legend he created has endured for more than 3 centuries and shows no signs of fading. He achieved the kind of lasting influence that comes only to those whose lives transcend their historical moment and speak to universal human experiences and desires. In coffee shops and taverns, in books and films, in the dreams of those who long for adventure and the arguments of those who fight for freedom, the influence of Calico Jack continues. The real pirate who inspired Jack Sparrow had given his final performance on that scaffold in Port Royal Harbour, but his greatest show, his transformation into legend, would run forever. Take what you can, give nothing back. It was more than a pirate's motto. It had become a philosophy of life that encouraged people to seize opportunities, to refuse to surrender their dreams, and to live according to their own vision of what life should be. The man who had died in chains had created something that would never be captured, never be defeated, and never be forgotten. The legend of Calico Jack had become larger than any single life, more powerful than any empire, and more enduring than any treasure. It was Jack Rackham's ultimate prize, the one reward that no governor could revoke and no executioner could take away. He had captured immortality itself, and in doing so, had given the world a gift that would keep on giving, for as long as humans continued to dream of freedom and adventure. The influence of Jack Rackham's story reached far beyond the realm of entertainment and literature. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, and as democratic revolutions swept across Europe and the Americas, the example of pirate crews who had governed themselves through elected leadership and collective decision-making took on new significance for political theorists and social reformers. The pirate articles that had governed crews like Rackham's were studied by scholars who were trying to understand how democratic institutions could function in practice. Here was empirical evidence that ordinary people, even those operating outside the bounds of civilized society, were capable of creating fair and effective systems of self-governance. The fact that these systems had emerged organically from the harsh necessities of maritime life, rather than being imposed by educated elites, made them even more compelling to those who believed in the democratic potential of common people. The compensation systems that pirate crews had developed for injured members also attracted attention from early social reformers. The idea that a community should collectively provide for those who had been harmed while serving the common good was radical for its time. Most societies expected individuals to bear the full cost of their misfortunes, but pirate crews had recognized that collective responsibility created stronger and more loyal communities. These practical innovations in democratic governance and social insurance would influence thinkers and reformers for generations. The example of Jack Rackham's crew, with their elected leadership, their fair distribution of rewards, and their care for injured members, provided a working model of how more just societies might be organized. It was a legacy that the historical pirate captain could never have imagined. The romantic elements of Rackham's story also continued to evolve and influence changing social attitudes. As the 19th century progressed and women began to demand greater rights and opportunities, the examples of Anne Bonny and Mary Red became increasingly significant. Here were women who had proven themselves capable of leadership, courage, and independence in an age when such qualities were supposedly beyond female capacity. The fact that these women had found acceptance and respect within Jack Rackham's crew, that they had been treated as equals rather than curiosities, suggested that gender equality was not an impossible dream, but a practical reality that could be achieved when prejudice was set aside. Their story became a touchstone for women's rights advocates, who argued that artificial restrictions on female participation in public life were harmful to society as a whole. The mystery surrounding their ultimate fate only added to their symbolic power. Because Anne Bonny and Mary Red had vanished from the historical record, they could be imagined as having achieved whatever outcome seemed most inspiring to those who told their stories. Some preferred to think they had died as martyrs to their cause, others that they had escaped to live free lives beyond the reach of conventional society. The ambiguity allowed them to become symbols of female potential rather than cautionary tales about the consequences of challenging social norms. This symbolic transformation was particularly important in the American context, where the ideals of individual liberty and democratic self-governance were becoming central to national identity. The story of pirates who had rejected monarchical authority and created their own democratic societies resonated strongly with colonists who were themselves challenging imperial control. The pirate crew's insistence on elected leadership and collective decision-making provided historical precedent for the revolutionary principles that would eventually shape American political institutions. The influence was not limited to formal politics. The entrepreneurial spirit that had driven pirates like Jack Rackham to seek their fortunes outside the established economic system also appealed to Americans who saw their new nation as a place where individual initiative and risk-taking could lead to success. The pirate captain who had risen from ordinary sailor to commander of his own vessel embodied the kind of self-made achievement that would become central to American mythology. This entrepreneurial interpretation of piracy glossed over many of the moral complexities of Rackham's actual career, but it captured something important about the American understanding of individual opportunity and social mobility. The idea that anyone could rise through their own efforts, that success should be based on merit rather than birth, that communities should be governed by consent rather than coercion. All these principles had been demonstrated in practice by pirate crews decades before they became foundational elements of American society. The religious implications of Jack Rackham's story also proved significant in unexpected ways. His rejection of established authority and his insistence on governing according to his own moral code resonated with Protestant traditions that emphasized individual conscience over institutional hierarchy. The democratic nature of pirate society, where every member had a voice and important decisions were made collectively, reflected Protestant ideals about the priesthood of all believers and the importance of congregational governance. This connection was strengthened by the fact that many of the early settlers in pirate havens like Nassau had been religious dissenters who had fled persecution in Europe. These communities were already inclined toward democratic governance and suspicious of hierarchical authority. The pirate crews that operated from these bases simply extended these principles to their maritime activities. The result was a unique fusion of religious, political, and economic ideals that would influence American culture for generations. The self-governing pirate crew became a model for how free communities might organize themselves, combining individual liberty with collective responsibility in ways that balanced personal freedom with social cohesion. As the 19th century progressed, the story of Jack Rackham continued to evolve in response to changing social and political circumstances. The abolition movement found in his tale a powerful argument against slavery and for human equality. Here was evidence that people of different backgrounds could work together as equals when artificial barriers were removed. The democratic nature of pirate society, where status was based on contribution rather than race or birth, provided a compelling vision of what integrated communities might achieve. The fact that pirate crews had often included men of African descent as full members, entitled to equal shares of plunder and equal voices in decision-making, contrasted sharply with the racial hierarchies that dominated legitimate society. This aspect of pirate democracy would be emphasized by abolitionists, who argued that racial equality was not only morally right, but practically beneficial to society as a whole. The labor movement also found inspiration in Jack Rackham's story. The democratic governance of pirate crews, with their elected leadership and fair distribution of rewards, provided a model for how working people might organize themselves to achieve better conditions and greater dignity. The pirate articles that guaranteed every crew member a voice in important decisions and a fair share of profits embodied principles that would later appear in labor union constitutions and collective bargaining agreements. The fact that pirates had been willing to risk everything for the right to govern themselves and receive fair compensation for their work resonated strongly with industrial workers who felt exploited by factory owners and excluded from political power. The example of men who had rejected wage slavery and created their own economic system provided hope that alternatives to industrial capitalism were possible. These political and social influences were reinforced by the continued popularity of pirate stories in literature and popular culture. Each new generation of writers found fresh meaning in Jack Rackham's tale, adapting it to address contemporary concerns while maintaining its essential appeal as a story of individual courage and collective achievement. The industrial age brought new interpretations that emphasized the contrast between the freedom of pirate life and the regimentation of factory work. Writers portrayed pirate crews as communities of skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work and shared in its rewards, while industrial workers were depicted as anonymous cogs in vast mechanical systems that stripped them of dignity and autonomy. This romantic vision of pirate society ignored many harsh realities, but it captured something important about the human costs of industrialization. The story of Jack Rackham and his democratically governed crew provided an alternative vision of how work and community might be organized, one that valued individual contribution and collective decision-making over efficiency and profit maximization. The expansion of literacy during the 19th century also contributed to the spread of Rackham's influence. As more people learned to read, pirate stories became accessible to broader audiences who found in them escapist entertainment as well as inspiration for their own struggles. The colorful adventures of Calico Jack and his crew provided relief from the monotony of industrial life, while also suggesting that dramatic change was possible for those brave enough to seize it. This democratization of pirate literature had profound cultural effects. Stories that had once been confined to educated elites now reached working-class audiences who could identify more directly with the common sailors who had chosen piracy over exploitation. The result was a new understanding of pirate history that emphasized its democratic and egalitarian elements rather than its criminal aspects. The growth of popular journalism during this period also contributed to the spread of Jack Rackham's influence. Newspapers and magazines competed for readers by publishing sensational stories about historical figures, and pirates were natural subjects for such treatment. The combination of adventure, romance and rebellion that characterized Rackham's career made him perfect material for journalists who wanted to capture public attention. These popular accounts often took considerable liberties with historical fact, but they served an important cultural function by keeping the story alive and relevant to contemporary audiences. Each retelling added new elements and emphasized different aspects of the tale, ensuring that it remained fresh and engaging even as it became familiar. The result was a continuous process of cultural evolution that kept Jack Rackham's story current and meaningful across generations. The basic elements remained constant: the democratic leadership, the romantic partnerships, the theatrical flair, but their interpretation and significance changed in response to shifting social conditions and cultural values. By the middle of the 19th century, the transformation of Jack Rackham from historical figure to cultural archetype was complete. He had become a symbol that transcended his original context, representing universal human aspirations for freedom, dignity, and the right to shape one's own destiny. The real pirate captain who had lived and died in the early 18th century had been replaced by a mythological figure who embodied timeless ideals about courage, leadership, and social justice. This mythological Calico Jack would continue to evolve throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining his essential appeal as a figure who had dared to live extraordinarily. His influence would be felt in political movements, social reforms, artistic expressions, and popular entertainment, always offering the same fundamental message that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept artificial limitations. The man who had chosen colourful clothing to distinguish himself from common sailors had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He had become truly distinctive, not just in his own time but across centuries. The real Jack who had inspired the fictional Jack Sparrow had created something more lasting than any treasure he could have captured. He had created a story that would continue to inspire and influence long after the world that had created him had disappeared into history. As we trace the continuing evolution of his legend through the industrial age and into the modern era, we can see how the basic elements of Jack Rackham's story have remained constant, while their meaning has continuously adapted to new circumstances. The democratic pirate captain, the partnership between men and women as equals, the rejection of arbitrary authority, the insistence on fair treatment and collective decision-making. All these themes have proven remarkably durable and relevant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The story continues to resonate because it addresses fundamental questions about human nature and social organization that remain as relevant today as they were 3 centuries ago. How should communities govern themselves? What is the proper balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility? How can people of different backgrounds work together effectively? What makes leadership legitimate and effective? Jack Rackham's career had provided compelling answers to these questions, not through abstract theorizing, but through practical demonstration. His crew had shown that democratic governance could work even under the most challenging circumstances, that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that leadership based on consent and competence could be more effective than authority based on force or tradition. These lessons had been transmitted across generations, not through academic study, but through popular culture, embedded in stories that entertained while they instructed. The real pirate who had inspired Jack Sparrow had created something more powerful than any political treatise or philosophical argument. He had created a living example that would continue to influence human thinking about freedom, justice, and possibility for as long as people continued to dream of better worlds. The Industrial Revolution that transformed the 19th century brought with it new ways of understanding Jack Rackham's legacy. As steam-powered ships replaced the wooden vessels that had ruled his seas, as telegraph cables connected distant continents in ways he could never have imagined, the world that had created Calico Jack seemed increasingly remote. Yet paradoxically, his influence only grew stronger as the pace of change accelerated. The factories that sprouted like mushrooms across Europe and America created conditions that made Rackham's democratic ideals more relevant than ever. Workers laboring 12 hours a day in dangerous, poorly ventilated buildings began to see parallels between their situation and that of the pressed sailors who had once turned to piracy as their only escape from tyranny. The pirate articles that had guaranteed every crew member a voice in important decisions became a model for early labour organisers who were trying to create unions that could bargain effectively with industrial owners. But it was not just the political aspects of his story that resonated with industrial age audiences. The sheer audacity of what he had accomplished captured imaginations dulled by the routine and predictability of factory life. Here was a man who had rejected the safe, conventional path and chosen to write his own destiny. At a time when most people's lives were increasingly regimented by clock towers and factory whistles, the image of Calico Jack sailing free across endless blue horizons offered a powerful alternative vision of what human existence might be. The women's suffrage movement found particular inspiration in the story of Bonny and Mary Red. As campaigns for voting rights intensified throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these two figures became symbols of what women could achieve when artificial barriers were removed. Their success as pirates, their acceptance as equals within Rackham's crew, their courage in battle, all provided historical evidence that female capabilities had been systematically underestimated and underutilized. The mystery that continued to surround their ultimate fate only enhanced their symbolic power. Suffrage leaders could point to these women as proof that female participation in public life was not a dangerous innovation, but a return to historical precedent. If women had once sailed as pirates, fought as warriors, and commanded as leaders, then their exclusion from political participation was revealed as an arbitrary restriction rather than a natural law. This historical argument proved particularly effective because it countered the common claim that women were inherently unsuited for public roles. Bonny and Mary Red had demonstrated their capabilities under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. If they could succeed as pirates, operating outside all social conventions and legal protections, then surely women could succeed as voters, as political candidates, as leaders in legitimate society. The expanding newspaper and magazine industry of the late 19th century played a crucial role in spreading these ideas. Publishers discovered that stories about historical figures like Jack Rackham could attract readers while also advancing particular social and political agendas. Progressive publications emphasized the democratic aspects of pirate society, while conservative outlets focused on the criminal nature of piracy and its ultimate failure. But regardless of the editorial stance, the basic elements of Rackham's story continued to circulate and influence public opinion. Each retelling reinforced the image of the colourful pirate captain who had governed through consent rather than coercion, who had treated women as equals, and who had created a society based on fairness and mutual respect. Even when writers intended to condemn piracy, they often ended up making it seem attractive by emphasizing these positive qualities. The emergence of photography during this period also contributed to the evolution of Jack Rackham's image. While no photographs of the historical figure existed, artists and illustrators began creating visual representations that would shape how future generations imagined him. These images typically emphasized his theatrical nature, showing him in elaborate costumes with dramatic poses that captured his flair for spectacle. The visual representation of Calico Jack became standardized during this period, establishing iconographic elements that would persist into the age of cinema and beyond. The colorful coat that had given him his nickname became increasingly elaborate in artistic depictions. The confident stance and theatrical gestures that had characterized his leadership style were emphasized and exaggerated. Most importantly, he was almost always shown in partnership with Bonny and Mary Red, reinforcing the collaborative nature of his leadership. These visual images were as important as written accounts in shaping public understanding of what Jack Rackham represented. They made abstract concepts like democratic leadership and gender equality concrete and memorable. A single illustration could communicate complex ideas about social organization and human potential more effectively than pages of written argument. The late 19th century also saw the emergence of what would later be called historical fiction. novels that used real historical figures and events as the basis for dramatic narratives. Jack Rackham's story proved perfect material for this new genre, offering writers a rich cast of characters and a dramatic arc that could support complex explorations of themes like freedom, justice, and social change. These novels typically took considerable liberties with historical fact, but they served an important cultural function by keeping Rackham's story alive and relevant to contemporary audiences. Writers could use his career as a framework for examining current social issues, addressing questions about labor relations, women's rights, and democratic governance through the lens of pirate adventures. The result was a continuous process of cultural adaptation that ensured Jack Rackham's influence would remain current and meaningful, even as the world continued to change around it. Each generation of writers found new relevance in his story, new ways to connect his 18th century adventures to contemporary concerns and aspirations. The Spanish-American War of 1898 brought another dimension to Rackham's cultural significance. As America emerged as a global naval power, operating in the same Caribbean waters where Calico Jack had once sailed, his story took on new meaning as a symbol of American independence and entrepreneurial spirit. The pirate captain who had rejected European authority and created his own society became a metaphor for American exceptionalism and self-determination. This nationalist interpretation glossed over many uncomfortable aspects of both pirate history and American expansion, but it captured something important about how Americans understood their relationship to established European powers. Just as Jack Rackham had challenged the authority of the British Empire and created an alternative form of social organization, America had rejected European models and developed its own distinctive institutions. The parallel was not exact, of course. America had achieved independence through political revolution rather than criminal activity, and American society was based on constitutional law rather than pirate articles. But the underlying themes of rejection of arbitrary authority and insistence on self-governance resonated strongly with American audiences, who saw their nation as fundamentally different from the monarchical societies of Europe. This American appropriation of Jack Rackham's legacy would prove particularly important as the 20th century approached, and America began to assert itself as a world power. The image of the democratic pirate captain who had challenged empire and created his own rules became a powerful symbol for a nation that saw itself as championing freedom and democracy against the forces of tyranny and oppression. The approaching turn of the century also brought technological innovations that would transform how Jack Rackham's story was told and understood. The invention of motion pictures created entirely new possibilities for bringing historical figures to life, for making their adventures vivid and immediate in ways that written accounts never could. Early filmmakers quickly recognized the cinematic potential of pirate stories. The colorful costumes, the dramatic sword fights, the exotic locations, all the elements that had made Jack Rackham's career so memorable were perfectly suited to the visual medium of film. The theatrical instincts that had characterized his leadership style translated naturally to the theatrical medium of cinema. But film also introduced new possibilities for interpreting and adapting his story. Directors could emphasize different aspects of his career, could create new adventures that captured the spirit of his historical exploits while appealing to contemporary audiences. The collaborative nature of filmmaking, with its need for producers, directors, writers and actors to work together toward common goals, even reflected the democratic ideals that had governed Rackham's crew. As the 19th century drew to a close, Jack Rackham had achieved a form of cultural immortality that transcended his historical existence. He had become a symbol that could be adapted to address almost any concern about leadership, democracy, social justice, or individual freedom. His story had been told and retold so many times, in so many different forms, that it had become part of the collective cultural memory of the English-speaking world. The real pirate captain who had lived and died in the early 18th century had been transformed into something far more significant than any historical figure could hope to become. He had become a myth that embodied fundamental human aspirations for freedom and dignity. The colourful coat that had once distinguished him from ordinary sailors had become a symbol of the human refusal to accept ordinary limitations. This mythological status ensured that Jack Rackham's influence would continue to grow and evolve as the world entered the 20th century. New technologies would provide new ways of telling his story. New social movements would find new relevance in his example. New generations would discover new meaning in his adventures. The man who had chosen piracy as an escape from the constraints of legitimate society had created something that could never be constrained by historical circumstance or cultural boundaries. His story had become a living thing that would continue to grow and adapt as long as humans continue to dream of living extraordinarily. The industrial age had tested the relevance of Jack Rackham's democratic ideals and found them not wanting. If anything, the harsh realities of factory life had made his vision of collaborative leadership and fair distribution of rewards more appealing than ever. The pirate captain, who had governed through consent rather than coercion, offered a compelling alternative to the authoritarian management styles that dominated industrial society. As the 20th century approached, bringing with it unprecedented challenges and opportunities, Jack Rackham's legacy stood ready to inspire new generations of dreamers and rebels. The real pirate who had inspired Jack Sparrow had created something more lasting than any treasure he could have captured. He had created a story that would continue to influence human thinking about freedom, justice, and possibility for centuries to come. The transformation was complete, but the influence was just beginning to reach its full potential. Take what you can, give nothing back. It was more than a pirate's motto now. It had become a philosophy of life that would guide and inspire anyone who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon them. The legend of Calico Jack was entering its greatest phase, ready to shape the dreams and aspirations of an entire new century of human adventure. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it technologies that would transform how Jack Rackham's story reached audiences around the world. The flickering images of early cinema offered something that no written account could provide: the ability to see Calico Jack's adventures unfold before your very eyes. Those first primitive films, with their jerky movements and silent action, nevertheless captured something essential about what had made the historical pirate so compelling. Directors quickly discovered that pirate stories were perfect for the new medium. The visual spectacle that had been central to Rackham's approach to leadership translated seamlessly to the silver screen. His theatrical entrances, his colourful costumes, his dramatic gestures, all the elements that had made him memorable in life became even more powerful when brought to cinematic life. But early filmmakers faced a challenge that would define how pirate stories were told for generations to come. The technical limitations of early cinema meant that complex political ideas about democracy and self-governance were difficult to convey through purely visual means. It was much easier to show sword fights and treasure hunts than to explore the nuanced ways that pirate crews had governed themselves. This technical constraint had profound cultural consequences. The democratic ideals that had been central to Jack Rackham's historical significance began to fade from popular understanding, replaced by simpler narratives of adventure and romance. The pirate captain, who had once symbolized political revolution, gradually became just another swashbuckling hero, whose main appeal was his ability to provide exciting entertainment. The transformation accelerated as Hollywood emerged as the dominant force in global entertainment. American filmmakers, working within a commercial system that demanded broad popular appeal, refined the pirate story formula to emphasize action over ideology. The complex figure of the historical Jack Rackham was simplified into a more marketable character who could appeal to audiences regardless of their political beliefs or social circumstances. Douglas Fairbanks became the first great cinematic pirate, establishing many of the conventions that would define the genre for decades to come. His athletic grace, his ability to perform spectacular stunts, his charming smile and perfect timing, all these qualities drew heavily on the theatrical tradition that could be traced back to Calico Jack. But Fairbanks' pirates were fundamentally different from their historical inspiration in one crucial respect. They were heroes who operated within conventional moral frameworks rather than rebels who challenged the fundamental assumptions of their society. This sanitization of the pirate figure reflected broader changes in how American culture understood rebellion and authority. The democratic ideals that had made Jack Rackham's story so compelling to earlier generations were now taken for granted in American society. Audiences no longer needed pirates to represent the possibility of self-governance because they lived in a society that had already embraced those principles. Instead, pirates became symbols of individual freedom within established social structures rather than alternatives to those structures. They represented the romantic notion that exceptional individuals could transcend ordinary limitations while still ultimately serving the cause of justice and social order. It was a fundamental transformation that preserved some of Jack Rackham's appeal while draining away much of his revolutionary significance. The two world wars of the early 20th century brought new dimensions to how audiences understood pirate stories. During times of global conflict, tales of maritime adventure took on patriotic overtones that would have astonished the historical pirates, who had rejected all national loyalties. Jack Rackham's democratic ideals were reinterpreted as specifically American values. His rejection of authority became resistance to tyranny, and his partnership with strong women became a symbol of the home front solidarity that was essential to wartime victory. Errol Flynn's portrayal of Captain Blood in 1935 represented the culmination of this process of patriotic transformation. Flynn's character embodied all the qualities that had made the legendary Jack Rackham so appealing. The theatrical flair, the democratic leadership, the romantic partnerships, the refusal to submit to unjust authority. But these qualities were now firmly embedded within a narrative framework that celebrated rather than challenged established social values. And so we reach the end of our journey through the extraordinary life of the man who gave birth to every pirate legend that followed. Jack Rackham lived for barely 30 years, commanded his own ship for less than 2, yet created something that has endured for over 3 centuries. From a common sailor seeking escape from tyranny, he became Calico Jack, the theatrical captain who proved that leadership could be based on respect rather than fear, that crews could govern themselves through democratic ideals, and that even the most unconventional partnerships could achieve greatness when built on mutual trust and shared purpose. His colourful coat may have long since crumbled to dust, but the symbol it represented, the refusal to accept ordinary limitations, the insistence on living life on your own terms, continues to inspire us today. Every time we see Captain Jack Sparrow swagger across our screens, we're witnessing the latest chapter in a story that began in those Caribbean waters 300 years ago. The real Jack had achieved something far more valuable than any treasure he ever captured. He had created a legend that would never die. Take what you can, give nothing back. It was more than a pirate's philosophy. It was a declaration that extraordinary life was possible for anyone brave enough to seize it. Jack Rackham had taken his freedom, his dignity, his right to live boldly, and he had given nothing back to those who would have kept him in chains. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest treasure of all.